Good evening and welcome to Chasing the Facts. This is January 13th, 2022, and if my father was still alive, he would say, Friday the 13th comes on a Thursday this month. That joke never got old for some reason, I don't know why. So with us this evening is Chelmsford's, get the title right, Sam, Chief Assessor, Frank Reen, and probably the guy that you love to hate, right? I don't think so. Frank's a nice guy. So what we're going to do this evening, we're going to talk a little bit about the property tax process in Chelmsford. And I had originally specified a number of topics that we could talk about, but then I got thinking about my actual tax bill, and I thought, you know, maybe it would be a little bit more interesting and beneficial for the audience if we actually talked about the tax bill, and then as we do that, we can get into how certain things work. And so Frank will explain to us what's going on. So I'm going to start off. My first question is, I received my tax bill on January 3rd. So I guess they were mailed out of the treasurer's office on the 29th of December. And the very first thing I noticed, I pick up my bill, and it says in the upper right-hand corner, fiscal year 2022, third quarter actual. So first question is, what does that mean, third quarter actual?
Very good. Thank you, first of all, for having me on here today, Sam, the opportunity to explain much of this information. Third quarter actual references that it's really the first bill you'll see that contains both the value of the property as well as the tax rate. Chelmsford, like many communities this size, has a quarterly billing system. So the first two bills are an estimated or preliminary bill. They're based on the prior year's taxes paid, split into roughly two payments. Because they're an estimated bill. At that time, the values haven't been certified, nor has the tax rate. That isn't done till the November-December time frame, which puts us about halfway through the fiscal year, at which time values, hopefully, and tax rate is certified, creating an actual tax amount owed for fiscal 22. You're credited for the first two payments paid, leaving a balance which is split into roughly two equal payments. So that's the reason people notice, and this year is certainly no different, that seldom do all four bills match. We try to adjust the preliminary bills to get them somewhat equal, but invariably they're not the same. And that was certainly the case this year.
So the adjustment is normally, what, around 3%?
That's right.
Okay, all right.
What we're allowed to do for the preliminary bills is two things we're allowed to do. Put on what the excluded debt is, plus a little bit, plus account for the statutory 2.5%. Also, for those parcels that had a tremendous amount of growth, a new home, a really substantial addition, or anything else, we're allowed to reflect that in the preliminary bills as opposed to waiting for the actual. Once again, the intent of it is to try and stabilize that tax amount for the resident or taxpayer.
Get it as close to what you think the actual is going to be.
Exactly.
Well, that's a very good explanation, and I'm glad to have that, because that's a question that I'm sure you get all the time.
Certainly do.
What does that mean, and what's the difference, and so on and so forth. So the next thing, after we see the title, of course, everybody's eye is going to go to the actual amount that they're being taxed. So if you look at your tax bill, and at the center of the tax bill, it'll say Town of Chelmsford, fiscal year 2022, third quarter actual real estate tax, and then you will get a summary, and that the total number will actually be your annual tax bill for that fiscal year. So I'm going to use my tax bill as an example as we talk through this, and I'm going to do that for a couple of reasons. Number one, because it's my tax bill and I can do it.
Certainly
okay. Secondly, I don't mind sharing the information with the audience, and I know some people probably wouldn't want to do that, but most of this information is available publicly anyway. But I don't mind talking about my tax bill. And the third reason I like using my situation as an example is, as luck would have it, my property value comes very, very close to the average single-family property value in Chelmsford. I'm never off by more than, usually it's between $2,000 and $5,000, and that's been historically correct. So for that reason, this is a good example, okay? So I look at my bill this year, and I see that my annual tax is going to be $7,863. That's for the whole year. And I say, wow, you know, that seems like a hike from the prior year. So the next thing that probably many taxpayers do is they go and they get their last year's third quarter bill, which I did. And I look at that and I say, well, now, wait a minute. My tax for fiscal year '21 was $7,120. Okay, that is a $741 difference this year over last year, and that translates into a 10.4% increase. So I'm at Mr. Average Taxpayer, and I say, now, wait a minute. I thought that under Proposition 2.5, there was a limitation on what the town could raise. So can you explain to the audience how I can have the Proposition 2.5 thought in my brain, but my property tax can go up 10.4%?
Certainly can. Thank you for asking the question. Prop 2.5 does govern how much the levy can go out from the previous year. So, but what it doesn't govern is individual assessments. They're analyzed each and every year, and they can go up however the market dictates. We look at it by ranch, by style of home, location within the town, neighborhood, lot size, all the factors that a prospective buyer would look at. So in doing so, we have within the residential, sticking with the residential class, we could have ranches appreciated at greater value than other styles of property. So that might dictate why taxes would go up for one style more than another within the residential class. Also, we have some additions to the levy this year because of the vote taken coming out of the town meeting. So that would account for some of the increase. But each and every year, many people's homes their tax amount might exceed a 2.5% increase because of the variations within, in this case, the residential class.
So so what that suggests to me is that although my property may have gone up by this percentage amount, it may be that some other type of real estate hasn't gone up that much, or in fact has actually gone down.
Even within the residential class?
Even within the residential class. So I know, for example, just as an example, I know that there's usually a pretty good discrepancy between the value track for a single-family home versus a condo, for example. Okay, so that would be part of it.
And in condos, what we've seen is we look at it by the complex itself. Some complexes were given the sales activity we saw, each and every year, there's always a complex or two that are flat. And this year was no exception. They literally had no increase in the valuation because we had enough sales out there that indicated those values should be left alone. Conversely, some complexes went up 15% because we had enough sales sample to warrant a fairly substantial increase.
Okay, so let me explore that just a little bit more, because what you said is very interesting. So you said that in some cases you've got condo complexes and the value year over year was stable, but in other cases it's actually gone up quite a bit. So what would account, from a market standpoint, what would account for those differences?
I think for different complexes, some of them are started to reach their economic life. They're getting on in years, some of the complexes here in town. One of the complexes, I won't name it, but it was built in the 80s. It's considered one of the more desirable ones. It was for decades, but I think it just reached its point of just its economic life. It just started to cap off in terms of the value. Others, for whatever reason, just kept accelerating in terms of their rates.
Okay.
I wish I knew why entirely. Some of them are just the location within the town became more desirable. Some of the demographics, too, might be dictating this.
Okay, that makes perfect sense when you talk about the age of the facility, because we know that part of the valuation process is, in fact, you use the cost method for looking at building structures and so forth.
Right.
So that would make perfect sense. Okay, that's good. All right, so I'm still stuck on my 10.4% increase here, which I have to pay, and that's fine.
Yep, same here.
But I say, now, wait a minute, that seems like a high increase, but, you know, okay, I can accept the situation on the market, and I think anybody who's been paying any attention to the real estate market over the last 2 years understands that that's, on the residential side, it's been pretty hot in this area. It certainly has. But I said, let's go back to fiscal 20, okay? So I dug that bill out. And I said, well, now, in fiscal 20, my tax bill was $7,160. In fiscal 21, it was $7,120. It actually went down from fiscal 20 to 21. So Did you work some sort of magic to make my tax bill go down?
I wish I could take the
what,
credit for that.
What happened there, Mr. Reen?
It informed me was, some wizardry on my part, but
Okay.
that's sadly not the case. For fiscal '21, of course, that put us right, into the middle of COVID, as we call. And the selectmen and the town manager, in order to provide some relief for the taxpayers here in town, effectively didn't raise as much money in the levy as they could have. It was offset by some money coming out of stabilization fund. Roughly, it's called excess levy capacity, roughly $3 million, 2.9, that was basically not raised that could have been raised. The result of which was a relatively mild increase overall, nowhere near 2.5%. The budget was fully funded, but the raise from the residents, taxpayers.
But the town manager and the select board and the town meeting did essentially make some budget
Absolutely.
adjustments. I mean, it wasn't that we just, decided we're not going to spend $3 million that we would normally spend. They actually had to take some action to support that lessening of an increase, if you will, on
That's
the budget
correct.
side. Okay.
And much of that was based on the uncertainty at the time in terms of right in the middle of COVID, and to provide relief for the taxpayers in town. And that, I think all taxpayers should have realized either a slight decrease as you did, or flat, or a modest increase.
Or a small increase.
Setting aside those who did a substantial amount of work in the home, of course. So that was for '21. We move into '22, and it was a slightly different story. A couple things were happening there. We had the residential valuations appreciating a little greater than the commercial industrial, so it was sort of an offset there. And there wasn't as much excess levy capacity as there had been in the prior year. Still, there was $1 million, which was not insignificant, but it was less than the prior year, and that was a contributing factor to the taxes increasing.
Did we put the $1 million back on the tax rate like we did the third year, or did we not do that this year?
We did the $1 million not on the tax rate.
Okay, so what we can do is we can look at this thing and say, well, as Frank just said, in fiscal '21, because of the economic circumstances and the impacts of COVID and all the reasons that Frank just articulated, the town manager and the select board took action, and they said, okay, we're not going to tax to the full amount that we're allowed to tax under the law, which is the levy. And that amounted to, I didn't remember it was that high. It was $3 million?
Just under
All
$3
right.
million, 2.9.
So again, using my property is a good example here because it does represent the average single-family value. The general rule of thumb is that for every $1 million on the levy, it's about $70 on the annual tax bill for the average single-family resident. So, and that's just about right. When I look at these numbers and go back and calculate the effect of what you just said, if we had in fact used the full levy capacity for that year, I saved about $200. That's
$10 would be about right.
just about right. So
Yep.
that actually worked. So that was I'm sure most people would say that was a very good thing
It was,
to have done. The downside is
the following year.
that you have to pay it back at
Yeah.
some point.
And just to be clear, it's not paying back money that was saved the prior year. It's just basically for fiscal '22, putting us closer to where we would have been had we not done that.
Correct.
The savings realized is the savings realized for the taxpayer. Another factor that can't be overlooked, and I think I stressed it at the classification hearing and other seminars, once again, the residential valuations outpaced the commercial. So we had a kind of natural shift. It's a zero-sum game. So if the residential values increase at a greater rate than did the commercial industrial, basically shifting the tax burden a little bit away from the commercial and towards the residential.
Yes, again, that's the natural shift. And then, of course,
That's right.
we have the unnatural shift. The select board, I'm going to hear from the select board on that. I shouldn't have characterized it that way. But they're not doing anything wrong, folks. This is something that is done in about a third of the municipalities of the state. I think it's about 110 or 112 now that actually do split the rate. So the select board, every year, when they set the tax rate, they get to make a decision. Are we going to have a single tax rate and tax every single taxpayer in town at the same tax rate? Or are we going to make a decision which, under the law, says we can have a higher tax rate for commercial and industrial and personal property versus what we charge for the residential. So why don't you take just a minute, Frank, and explain that, okay?
Yep. Each and every year, I give a presentation, as every assessor does, before the select board, the governing body, to look at a number of different things. And the driving one really is whether to split the tax rate. It's largely there are no shortage of studies on the issue. It is largely a philosophical.
No, there aren't.
It's largely a philosophical question that I know the board takes very, very seriously. And basically it's a shift in the taxes to have the commercial, industrial, and personal property share a larger portion of the tax burden. That was enacted in fiscal 19, along with the small commercial exemption, which only maybe, 12 to 15 communities participate in. And what that does, what the small commercial exemption allows is for those commercial properties that qualify, they get a 10% tax break. I'll briefly go over that. They have to be valued for less than $1 million and also have 10 or fewer full-time employees on an average basis for the year. We have, I think, this year 250 that qualify. So that provides a little bit of relief for those commercial properties. In this past year, last year, the split rate was a 122, I believe. So roughly that means commercial industrial properties were paying 22% greater in taxes than they would have with a single rate. This year for fiscal 22, it was dropped down to 1.20 or 2% less. And that's where we sit now.
So just, if I can summarize, just add just a little bit to that. So just using a very simple example, if the board says we're going to split the rate at 120, what that really means is that the commercial and industrial properties will pay 20% more in taxes than they otherwise would have. And that dollar amount that they pay extra is then subtracted from the total residential real estate valuation, which lowers that number, and that's how you get the lower rate. Have I described that correctly?
You've described that accurately, and it's roughly sort of like a 5-to-1 ratio, I think.
Yes, right.
I think roughly 4 or 5% is what they're saying at this point. So
for properties that are of the same, that means
that's right.
If your residence is 500,000 and your commercial is 500,000, it's about a 5-to-1
That's
split.
right.
Right. Okay. So that's how that works. So the residential folks get some benefit, not as much as they would in towns like Burlington, where the value split is closer to 45-55.
That's correct.
All right. So and it's easier to split the rate in those communities for the businesses because they don't have to take up quite so much of the slack as the ratio would be a little less.
That's right.
In Burlington. So anyway, okay, I'm not done with the tax bill yet.
Fair enough.
Okay, so you're off the hook so far. I still have to pay the bill, but now at least I understand, what's happened year over year. But let's look at the values, and this is interesting. And maybe it doesn't mean much because I'm not going to sell my house tomorrow, but this is interesting. And then perhaps you can explain a little bit about how the value affects the overall taxes. So this year, I'm looking at my value, and I see that it's 493, which is almost the
It is almost
like I
average,
said,
yep.
almost the average. But the year before, it was 447. So I went up 10.2% on my property value. And one good thing that I do like about our tax bills is it does give you the breakdown between the land value
Yes.
and the building value, which I think is good information to have. So it looks like my land value this year went up 9%, and my building value went up 11.5%. And if you combine the two values, that comes out to a 10.2% overall. Whereas the year before, I find this to be very interesting. In fiscal 21, I was at 447. In the prior year, I was at 430. The value between 20 and 21, my value went up only 3.9%. So this year it went up 10.2. The prior year it went up 3.9. So can you talk a little bit about that?
I can. I want to address the land part of it first.
Okay.
It was, how do you come up with the land values? Well, in a perfect world, we would have 30 or 40 land sales, but in Chelmsford, that is essentially built out, effectively.
You're talking vacant.
Vacant land. What's a vacant lot go for? A vacant buildable piece of land. We don't have a lot of those that transfer each year. So what we use is, it's called residual land. And basically, we take the sales value, the sale that we have on single-family homes, and we subtract the building value we're carrying on that property, the depreciated land, building value. That leaves us an indicated value. And then we use that as a governing for our land valuation. That gives us a ratio. This is certified by the Department of Revenue as is the overall value. Not only do they want to look at the overall values, they want to look at the residual land and make sure that that makes sense for all the different neighborhoods within the town. So that's how we attack the land. The building value, we use a couple things. We get it from Marshall and Swift cost tables, as well as some other sources, subscription sources we have for building values. And then what we have, and this is sort of the, if you accept the notion that assessments are both a science and an art, depreciation. We have to account for the fact that your home, like my home is about 110 years old. It's a wasting asset, if you will. It's a depreciating piece of property. The land doesn't depreciate, but the building certainly does. So we have to build that into the assessment. And so it's the replacement cost new, less depreciation for the building value.
Okay, so following up on that, just a little bit more, hopefully this will help, or maybe it won't.
Yep.
So if I have a brand-new house, if I knock my house down tomorrow, and I hope my wife isn't watching, if I knock my house down tomorrow and we decide we're going to build a new one, and we build a house that is the exact duplicate of the house I have, okay, what adjustment would be made on my tax bill?
What you would see in that, at least on the land, would be the same.
The same, right.
The building would have minimal depreciation. It's like a car. The second you drive it off the lot, it's depreciating. So the first year, you might see a 1 or 2% depreciation. Beyond that, it would be almost fully replacement cost new.
Okay, so I think, and this you don't see in your tax bill, folks, but if you call the assessor's office and ask for the information, they'll give it to you, or you can go up on the website and you can use the portal and check your own property situation. It's sort of a modified version of the property card.
Yep.
And it will tell you right on there what your depreciation factor is for your property.
Yes, it will.
Okay, but you can always call the office, talk to Frank or any of the staff, and they can walk you through that process. So if I remember correctly, I think you've got me at 60%. Which, I do have an accounting background. That seems reasonable to me for the age of the house. What about if I decide I'm going to do some renovations to the property?
Good question.
Okay?
If you do some renovations, particularly the renovations are type that sort of encompass a good portion of the home, really add some, really change the effective year on that home. We carry two things on every property: the year it was actually built and the effective year. The effective year is, once again, a tool for depreciation, one of many, one of several. And that's what, so we're saying, your home was built in 1960. However, given all the work that's been done, it's effectively a year 2000. We recognize that the foundation and the framing is still original, but all the other cosmetics, if you will, is much newer. Appliances, cabinetry, that sort of thing. So we would have that come up a little bit. Conversely, if a home has deferred maintenance, to be kind, we would bring down the effective year. And we have some other tools to recognize that a home that has some deferred maintenance may have a very low building value, frankly. The land would once again be still valued what the land is valued for. Excuse me. But the building we want to carry a somewhat lesser value.
Now, how would you know about deferred maintenance unless you would actually go out and look at the property?
That would be the way.
That was the way.
That
Okay.
is the way. Sometimes they'll transfer, and we see that.
Okay.
When homes transfer, we send out a sales verification, and that often can trigger some activity that we become aware of the property. Also, the application for abatement, which I know we're going to get into in a minute.
Yep. Well, we better get into it now because we have about 5 minutes left
Okay.
in the show. So why don't we, so I think that's wonderful. You've given a really good explanation. A lot of this is pretty meaty, and if people want more information, we can have Frank back on at a later time and we can get into it in more detail. But I think that's great. Now I understand my tax bill. I'm going to feel a little better about writing the check. All right, that's good.
But you're not happy with the assessed value. You think it's excessive.
No, actually, Unfortunately, I know enough about this to know that it's accurate. I'm fine.
appreciate
I will not be asking for an abatement, but
In the event that you
for
did,
those people who do ask for abatements, go.
you have the right to file an application for abatement once this bill has been mailed, which means now. You have till February 1st to get an application for abatement into my office, no later than February 1st. They can be, the applications are available online on my webpage. You call us, we'll send one in the mail. It's a simple one-page form. Many of the questions that are asked can be answered by the information you have on your front of your tax bill. It gives you the opportunity, an open paragraph down the bottom to make your contention, whether you want to list sales you're aware of in the area or concerns you have about the home in general, specifically, I should say.
In other words, give a reason why you think the value is too high.
Exactly. Give me something to go on. If you want to do something more lengthy, more ambitious.
And there are those who have done that.
Yes, there are. You can attach anything you want to the application. Pictures, a narrative, an appraisal. Many people have had appraisals done over the last year, 18 months. If they have an appraisal that supports their contention that I've had it overvalued, I'll absolutely take a look at that. That's not to say it's a rubber stamp that I'm going to go by that appraisal, because there are certain time frames and I would want to agree with it. But we do act on these. We take them seriously, as you know, Sam, myself and the board. I don't know what percentage we act favorably on, but I would venture to say it's probably over half.
I think I think that's right.
So I would urge any taxpayer, I would urge every taxpayer to take a look at the value. Certainly feel free to call my office for their property record card. It's very detailed and maybe a little bit busy in some people's minds, but it does have a lot of good information. And I would urge them to look at it, and feel free to give me a call. I talk to residents all the time.
And the office will work with you.
Yes.
You'll get your questions answered. You might not like some of the answers, but you'll get your questions
That's right.
answered.
The other thing I want to bring up in my 3 minutes is everybody should have received within their bill a stuffer, a yellow stuffer just like that.
I don't know if Pete can show this. It's a 8.5 by 11.
That's right,
yellow
boldly
piece of
colored.
paper, printed both sides.
Both sides.
Yep.
And it's boldly colored to capture people's attention. It describes in some detail what's offered by the town in terms of exemptions for people that are greater than 65. It's self-explanatory for the most part, so I won't go into detail. However, if they find any of it confusing or they want some assistance, once again, the staff in my office, as well as myself, can answer any question they may have about possibly qualifying for any of these statutory exemptions.
Mm-hmm. So that's good. We have a couple minutes left. Maybe you want to take just a couple minutes and describe what the process is after you get the abatement requests and the exemption requests. What happens then? You do something and then it goes before the board.
That's
what
right.
happens?
We get the applications for abatement. They're date stamped in and noted to be timely. I take a look at them. I do a little research. If they've given me something to review, I review it. Ultimately, I put it before the board. I describe what's going on. Very often I'll have a recommendation. Sometimes the board will go along with it in their infinite wisdom, and other times when they're less wise, they'll
Yeah, board has its lapses.
they'll send me back to do more research, fine, which was perfectly fine, and what I want out of my board. Ultimately, and then a decision is made, the board signs it, and the taxpayer is notified. If the taxpayer is still aggrieved, they could file with the appellate tax board.
How do they get the rake off? If the board says, okay, you know what, we overvalued, the property was overvalued, so now the taxpayer is due a refund of sorts,
right.
How does that work?
Depending on the timing of the abatement and the process, because there is a process that goes to the collector's office, that sort of thing, it would be taken off probably the fourth quarter bill. They'll see the reduction. It'll be literally reduced by the amount that was abated.
So you don't get a check from the town. You get a credit on your tax.
Get a credit on the bill. However, if it's because we do have some time to respond to these, it could be after the fourth quarter payment. At which time, if all 4 quarters are paid and you granted the abatement, you would get a check in that instance.
Okay. So actually, we're almost out of time. And I just want to thank Frank for coming in. This is it's quite a technical process.
It is.
That the assessing office goes through. And I just want people to understand that this isn't arbitrary. This is all governed by state law. The assessor and his staff are well-trained and well-schooled in these processes, and standardized methodology is implied. And whatever the assessor does in terms of making his value determinations, it all has to be signed off by the state. We don't get the final say. The state has to review his work, And very often, they will come back with questions, and that process has to be finalized before the tax rate can be set. That's how it works. Thank you very much, Frank, and we'll have you back later.
That sounds good. Thank you, Sam.